have always been the type of person who enjoys solitude in nature. While most people prefer the safety and social aspect of camping in groups, I relish the quiet, the self-reliance, and the feeling of being away from everything. Over the years, I had built up my skills, navigating with a compass, reading terrain, and handling emergency situations. But there are some things you can't prepare for, some things that don't follow the rules of the wild. This happened in the Northern Rockies, in an area that doesn't see many visitors. I had mapped out a 4-day solo camping trip along an old logging road that cut deep into the pine forest. The route wasn't marked, but I had studied topographical maps, planned my stops, and carried enough supplies to last well beyond my intended stay. I was confident, experienced, and completely alone. The first day was perfect. I set up camp near a small, clear stream, cooked a hot meal, and fell asleep to the soothing sounds of the forest. The second day was uneventful as well, just a long, satisfying hike deeper into the wild. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. It began subtly. Around sunset, as I was tending to my fire, I heard what I initially thought was a distant scream. It carried on the wind, faint and almost indistinguishable from the usual forest sounds. At first, I told myself it was probably a coyote or a fox, but something about it unsettled me. The tone wasn't quite right. It had a human quality to it, like someone calling for help. Yet, it was distant enough that I couldn't be sure if my mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on my food and the warmth of the fire. But even as the flames crackled, the feeling of unease clung to me. The real terror began at night. I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. It was slow, deliberate, just a few shuffling footsteps. My entire body froze. I held my breath, listening intently. The steps were light but unmistakable. Something or someone was circling my tent. My first thought was that it could be an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But the footsteps were too careful, too precise. They stopped for a long moment right behind my tent. I gripped my knife in my hand, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to call out, but something deep inside told me not to. Instead, I just listened, every nerve in my body alert. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated into the woods. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving, waiting to hear them again. But the night remained silent after that. Morning came, and with the light of day, my fear felt ridiculous. I forced myself to step out of my tent, knife still in hand. The ground was damp from the morning dew, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, human, barefoot. They circled my tent once and then led off into the woods. My blood ran cold. There was no logical explanation for this. No sign of a campsite nearby, no other gear, nothing. Just those eerie footprints disappearing into the trees. I had two options: pack up and leave immediately, or finish my trip as planned. My pride didn't want me to turn back, but my gut was screaming at me to get out. In the end, I convinced myself it was just some weird coincidence. Maybe a lost hiker. Maybe someone playing a prank, though that seemed unlikely in such a remote place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I made sure to camp in a different spot. I walked for miles, going off my planned route, trying to find a place that felt safe. But no matter how far I went, the feeling of unease followed me. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf sent my heart racing. And then, in the dead of night, I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. They approached my tent, slow and deliberate. I gripped my knife so tightly my hand hurt. The steps came right up to the entrance of my tent and stopped. Whoever it was stood there, just outside, silent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just waited, my body locked in place, heart hammering against my ribs. Then, a long, slow exhale, right outside my tent. I lost all sense of reason. In one frantic motion, I unzipped the tent and lunged outside, knife in hand, ready to confront whatever was there. But there was nothing, just the still, dark forest. The moon barely illuminated the trees, casting long, twisted shadows. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. And then I saw them, the footprints, fresh in the damp earth right in front of my tent. I didn't bother packing. I grabbed my essentials, my knife, my flashlight, my GPS, and I ran. I didn't care about my gear. I didn't care about my planned route. I just needed to get out. I moved through the forest at a reckless pace, tripping over roots and pushing past branches. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would explode. Only when the first light of dawn crept over the mountains did I stop. I had no idea how far I had gone. I checked my GPS. I was miles off my original path, but I was close to the logging road, close to my truck. I kept moving, slower now, but still with urgency. Every few minutes, I checked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. When I finally reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost collapsed. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there, shaking. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat, staring out at the trees, half expecting to see a figure standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, only the quiet, empty forest. I never went back to that area. I told myself it was just some drifter, some lost hiker. But deep down, I know that whoever or whatever was out there that night wasn't lost. They knew exactly where I was. Camping had always been a tradition for our group. We were 5 guys, myself, Jake, Mark, Tyler, and Ryan. Friends since high school who tried to get together at least once a year despite our busy lives. This trip was supposed to be a weekend of fishing, drinking, and reliving old memories. We chose a remote spot deep in the Adirondacks, a good half-day's hike from the nearest road to make sure we wouldn't be disturbed. We set off on a Friday morning, parking our cars at the designated lot and shouldering our heavy packs. The trail was rugged, winding through dense forest with thick undergrowth and towering pines. The air was crisp, and birds called to each other in the treetops. The farther we went, the quieter it became, the distant hum of civilization fading away. It was perfect. By mid-afternoon, we found the ideal site, a clearing near a lake with a fire ring left behind by previous campers. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and cracked open a few beers. The lake was pristine, its surface glassy under the late afternoon sun. Tyler and Ryan took out their fishing rods, while the rest of us lounged around the fire pit, joking and catching up. As the sun dipped behind the trees, we built a fire and cooked dinner. Everything was going as planned until Mark spoke up. "I swear I heard voices earlier," he said, poking at the fire with a stick, like whispering, just beyond the trees. Jake laughed. "Probably just the wind, man." Mark frowned but let it go. We passed around a bottle of whiskey and stayed up late, swapping stories and stoking the fire until only embers remained. One by one, we turned in for the night. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't an animal. It was something moving, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight on the ground just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. The fire was low but still casting a faint glow. Shadows flickered against the tent walls. I unzipped the tent slightly and peeked out. Nothing, just the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I shook my head, blaming the whiskey, and went back to sleep. Morning came, and the first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No birds, no wind, just an unnatural silence. I stepped out of my tent and stretched, taking in the scene. That's when I noticed it. Mark's tent was gone. Not collapsed, not moved, just gone. At first, I thought maybe he had woken up early and packed up his gear, but there was no sign of his stuff anywhere.
No sleeping bag, no backpack.
Just an empty patch of disturbed dirt where his tent had been. Panic started creeping in. I woke the others and we searched the area calling Mark's name. No answer. We scoured the perimeter of the campsite, checking for footprints leading away. There were none. "This doesn't make any sense," Ryan said, rubbing his arms against the morning chill. "Even if he left in the middle of the night, he would have had to take his gear. It's not like he just walked away naked. But where are his tracks?" Tyler added, looking around. "The ground's soft. If he walked away, there should be prints." There were none, just the 5 sets we had made the day before. We split up, each taking a different direction. I went toward the lake, my stomach in knots. The water was perfectly still.
No ripples, no disturbance.
I scanned the shoreline, half expecting to see Mark's boots or his backpack washed up. But there was nothing. I cupped my hands around my mouth and called his name. My voice echoed across the water, but there was no response. A deep unease settled in my gut. An hour passed, then 2. We reconvened at the fire pit, our faces drawn. "What the hell do we do?" Jake asked. He wouldn't just leave. "We need to get help," I said. "The nearest ranger station is at least a half-day's hike. One of us should go." "No," Ryan interrupted. "We stick together. Whatever happened to Mark, it's not normal." That was the moment it sank in. This wasn't just a lost hiker situation. Something else was going on. With no other options, we stayed one more night. The mood was tense. We built a larger fire, keeping our backs to each other, scanning the darkness. Every snapped twig made us jump. Somewhere past midnight, I thought I heard breathing. Slow, measured, just beyond the fire's glow. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to say something, but I was afraid if I acknowledged it, it would get worse. Then Jake whispered, "Do you hear that?" The fire flickered, casting long shadows. The breathing sound faded, replaced by something else. A quiet rustling, as if something was moving through the underbrush. Slowly, purposefully, I gripped my flashlight and shined it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but nothing was there. Just the trees swaying slightly. Then the whispering started. Faint, almost indistinct, like voices just beyond our understanding, moving around us, circling. It wasn't the wind. "We're leaving," I said, standing up. "Now." No one argued. We grabbed what we could and started moving, flashlights bouncing as we stumbled down the trail. The whispering followed us, just at the edges of the darkness. Never too close, never too far. We hiked the entire night, exhaustion making us sluggish, but fear keeping us moving. When the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the whispering finally stopped. We reached the ranger station by midday, wild-eyed and sleep-deprived. We reported Mark missing. They organized a search, but nothing was ever found.
No tent, no gear, no footprints.
It was as if he had never been there. The official report called it an unexplained disappearance. They chalked it up to an accident, maybe a bear attack, but we knew better. We never spoke about it again, and we never went camping again. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear that whispering, just beyond the edges of the dark. Camping alone has always been something I enjoyed. The isolation, the peace, the quiet, just me and the wilderness. I wasn't an experienced outdoorsman by any means, but I had been on enough solo trips to know how to handle myself. I knew how to set up a solid campsite, how to store food properly to avoid attracting animals, and how to read a map and compass. I also knew that the biggest threat in the woods wasn't the wildlife, it was other people. That thought was always in the back of my mind whenever I camped alone. But I didn't think it would ever become a reality. This trip was supposed to be simple. I had a 3-day weekend and decided to drive out to a national forest a few hours from home. It wasn't a well-known area, which was part of the appeal. Fewer people meant fewer distractions. I arrived in the early afternoon, parked my truck at the trailhead, and hiked about 6 miles into the forest. The trees were thick, tall pines and firs, with underbrush dense in some areas and open in others. I followed a narrow, unmarked trail that led me deeper into the woods, eventually finding a nice, flat clearing near a small creek. It was perfect. I set up camp quickly. Tent up, firewood gathered, food hung in a tree a safe distance away. By the time the sun started to set, I had a good fire going and was sitting on a log, enjoying the quiet. I ate my dinner, just some canned beans and beef jerky, then leaned back against a tree, staring into the flames. The night was cool but not cold, and there was barely any wind. It was one of those nights where the forest seemed completely still. That's when I saw him, just beyond the fire's glow. Maybe 30 or 40 feet away, a man was standing in the trees. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The flickering firelight made the shadows dance, and sometimes, a dark shape could look like something it wasn't. But as I stared, my stomach slowly sank. He was real. He wasn't moving, just standing there, partially obscured by the trees. I could only see his outline, the way his shoulders slumped slightly forward, the way his head was tilted just a little too far to one side. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. I cleared my throat and called out, "Hey!" No response. "Hello!" Nothing. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The man didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam directly at him. The second the light hit, he turned and walked deeper into the woods. Not running, not reacting, just walking away, disappearing into the darkness without a sound. I stood frozen for several seconds, staring at the spot where he had been. My breath felt tight in my chest, my hands gripping the flashlight too hard. I had 2 thoughts at once. 1, what the hell was that? 2, I need to leave now. But my truck was 6 miles away, and hiking out in the dark wasn't a great option. If I panicked and got lost, I could end up in an even worse situation. I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths, telling myself he was probably just another camper, maybe a hunter, maybe even a hiker who got turned around. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I had been camping alone plenty of times. When people stumble across someone else's campsite in the woods, they usually announce themselves, call out, wave, explain why they're there. They don't just stand there. I sat back down, forcing myself to think rationally. The fire was bright, and I had a knife and bear spray within reach. I wasn't defenseless. I would stay alert, keep the fire going, and wait until morning. I didn't sleep. Every little sound made my heart jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I kept my flashlight in my lap, ready to flick it on at any sign of movement. The night dragged on, endless and suffocating. At some point, probably around 3 a.m., I heard something, a rustling, just at the edge of the darkness. I snapped my flashlight on, aiming it toward the sound. Nothing. Then I heard it again. Breathing. Slow. Steady. Not an animal. Not wind. Someone was standing just beyond the trees, watching me. I gripped my knife so hard my knuckles turned white. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to call out again, to yell, to demand they leave, but my throat felt like it had closed up. I could barely swallow. The breathing continued. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, listening, staring into the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. The forest went completely still again. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping my knife, staring into the dark until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. Only then did I start packing. I moved fast, stuffing my gear into my pack, kicking dirt over the fire. I wanted to be gone as soon as possible. But before I left, I walked over to where the man had been standing the night before. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, deep ones. He had been there. He had been real. And on the tree next to where he had stood, something was carved into the bark. I watched you sleep. I hiked out faster than I had ever hiked in my life, checking over my shoulder the entire way. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, throwing my gear into the back and locking the doors the second I climbed in. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't go camping alone again. And I still wonder, if I had fallen asleep that night, what would have happened? Would I have woken up? Or would I have simply disappeared into the woods, just like him? I never used to be the kind of person who believed in bad luck or omens. I always figured that if something felt off, it was just nerves, paranoia, or my mind playing tricks on me. That changed after the night my girlfriend and I camped in the wrong place. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Nothing crazy, just a short drive to a state park, some hiking, a night under the stars, and then back home. We weren't deep woods survivalists or anything, but we both loved the outdoors and had done plenty of camping together. My girlfriend, Rachel, was especially excited because she had just bought a new sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, and she wanted to test it out before we planned a bigger trip later that year. We left early Saturday morning, the car packed with everything we needed: tent, sleeping bags, food, water, flashlight, matches. The drive took about 3 hours, winding through stretches of quiet farmland before giving way to dense forest. By the time we pulled up to the ranger station at the entrance of the park, the sun was already starting to lower in the sky, and that's when we hit our first problem. The campground was full. It was a holiday weekend, something we hadn't even considered, and every single designated campsite had already been claimed. The ranger at the station, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, shook her head sympathetically when we asked if there were any cancellations or overflow spots. "Sorry, folks. You can check with the private campgrounds outside the park, but they'll probably be booked up too," she said. I sighed, rubbing my jaw. The thought of driving all the way back home was disappointing, but I didn't want to set up a tent next to an RV park filled with families and blaring radios either. Rachel, however, wasn't ready to give up. "What about dispersed camping?" she asked. "Are there areas where we can camp off the grid?" The ranger hesitated. "Technically, yes," she admitted. "There are sections of the forest where camping is allowed as long as you follow the guidelines. But I have to warn you, there aren't any marked sites, and it's easy to get turned around out there. We had an incident a couple of years back." She didn't elaborate on what kind of incident, but something about the way she said it made my stomach clench slightly. Rachel, however, was already grinning at me. "This could be fun, like real wilderness camping," she said. I sighed, but I agreed. In the end, it was just one night. The ranger gave us a map and pointed out a few areas where dispersed camping was allowed. "Just be sure to follow leave no trace principles," she added. "And be careful." Something in her tone made me pause, but before I could ask her what she meant, Rachel was already pulling me toward the car. We drove for about 30 minutes down winding gravel roads, following the map the ranger had given us. The deeper we went, the rougher the road became. Eventually, it was little more than a dirt path with thick trees on either side. There were no other cars, no signs, nothing but the wilderness pressing in around us. Finally, we found a small clearing just off the path. It was overgrown with weeds, but there was an old, blackened fire ring made of stones, evidence that someone had camped here before. "This is perfect," Rachel said, already climbing out of the car. I wasn't so sure. Something about the sight felt off. It was hard to put my finger on, but it just seemed too quiet. I've been camping enough to know that forests are rarely silent. There should have been birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the hum of insects. But here there was nothing, just an empty stillness. Rachel, of course, didn't notice. She was already unloading the gear, spreading out the tent tarp, and humming to herself. Not wanting to seem paranoid, I pushed my unease aside and helped her set up camp. Within an hour, we had a fire going, and the scent of burning would fill the air. We ate a quick dinner of pre-packed sandwiches and sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth as the night deepened. The feeling of unease hadn't entirely left me, but as I sat beside Rachel, watching the flames flicker, I started to relax. Maybe I was just spooked by the ranger's warning. Then, sometime around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There hadn't been a noise or movement that I could remember, but something had pulled me from sleep. I lay still, listening. Rachel was curled up in her sleeping bag beside me, breathing evenly. Outside the tent, the fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, pulsing glows against the fabric walls. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate shuffling sound. Footsteps. They weren't coming from the road. They weren't the heavy, crashing movements of an animal. They were slow, measured, circling our tent. I felt a cold dread crawl up my spine. I reached over and gently shook Rachel awake. She mumbled something, half asleep. I pressed a finger to my lips, gesturing for her to listen. She froze. The footsteps were still there. Closer now. We waited, barely breathing. The sound moved to the back of the tent, then stopped. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but I was afraid to make any noise. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. Then suddenly the breathing started. Soft, steady, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. Rachel gripped my arm so tightly it hurt. I could feel her nails digging into my skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved again, slowly retreating into the woods. We stayed frozen in place for what felt like an eternity. When the sun finally started to rise, we packed up as fast as we could, barely speaking. When we reached the main road, I finally pulled over, hands shaking. Rachel was pale. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. Later, when we told the story to a friend who lived nearby, he went quiet for a long time. Then he told us something that made my stomach drop. A few years ago, a woman had been murdered in those woods. They never found the killer. And the campsite? It wasn't an official site. It was the place where her body had been found. We had spent the night in the wrong place, and something or someone had been out there with us. My dad and I had been planning this trip for months. We both loved hunting, and Montana's backcountry promised an experience like no other. Vast, untamed wilderness, rugged terrain, and the kind of isolation that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. We left early on a crisp October morning, our truck loaded with rifles, camping gear, and enough supplies to last a week. The plan was simple. Drive as far as the dirt roads would take us, hike deep into the forest, and set up camp near a ridgeline where elk were known to pass through. The first 2 days went smoothly. We trekked deep into the woods, found a perfect clearing for our camp, and spent the day's tracking game. The nights were cold but peaceful, the kind of quiet that was both soothing and unsettling. No distant hum of cars, no city lights, just the flickering fire and the occasional rustling of animals moving in the dark. On the third day, the weather turned. A storm rolled in fast, black clouds swallowing the sky. We heard thunder in the distance, a low growl growing louder as the wind picked up. Dad checked the map, frowning. "We need to find shelter," he said. "Storm like this, we don't want to be stuck in a tent." We packed up quickly, stuffing our gear into our packs as the first drops of rain fell. Dad had a vague memory of an old, abandoned cabin a few miles from our camp, something he had heard about years ago from another hunter. We figured it was worth a shot, better than trying to weather the storm in the open. By the time we found it, the rain was coming down hard, soaking through our jackets. The cabin stood in a small clearing, hidden by towering pines. It was old, real old. The wooden walls were weathered and gray, the roof sagging slightly under years of neglect. A rusted-out lantern hung beside the door, swaying in the wind. Dad tested the door. It groaned open, the hinges barely holding on. Inside, it was just as expected. Dust-covered floorboards, a stone fireplace, a few broken chairs, and an old wooden table. There was a pile of firewood stacked against the far wall, probably left by some other hunter seeking shelter years ago. "Good enough," Dad muttered. We got a fire going quickly, stripping off our wet clothes and hanging them near the warmth. The storm raged outside, rain hammering the roof, wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There were footprints in the dust, fresh ones, leading from the fireplace to the door. "Someone else has been here," I said, my voice low. Dad looked up, his expression unreadable. "Could be another hunter. Maybe they left before the storm hit." I nodded, but something about it made my skin crawl. The prints weren't scattered, like someone pacing or moving around. They were direct, as if whoever made them had stood by the fireplace, then walked straight to the door, and vanished. As the night went on, the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Dad sat by the fireplace, cleaning his rifle. I stretched out on an old blanket we had laid on the floor, listening to the storm. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had died down, casting the room in near darkness. Then I saw it. The door was open, not just a little, wide open. The wind howled through the doorway, rain sprang in, but that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the fact that I knew, absolutely knew, Dad had locked it before we went to sleep. I sat up, my heart pounding. Dad stirred beside me, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking at the open door. He grabbed his rifle and stood, moving toward the doorway. I followed, my own gun clutched tightly in my hands. We stepped onto the porch, shining our flashlights into the storm. Nothing, just trees swaying violently in the wind. We went back inside, locking the door again. Dad didn't say much, but I could tell he was on edge. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the wind blown it open? Had someone, or something, been watching us? Hours passed. The storm began to ease, the wind dying down. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound. A slow, deliberate creak. I opened my eyes. The door was open again. A wave of dread crashed over me. I shot up, gripping my rifle. Dad was already awake, his gun aimed at the doorway. We didn't speak, didn't move. We just listened. Then footsteps, not coming from outside, from inside. A slow shuffle near the back of the cabin. I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was nothing back there but an old wooden shelf and some collapsed furniture. No doors, no windows. "Who's there?" Dad called, his voice firm. Silence. Then a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. "Leave." Dad fired. The gunshot echoed through the cabin, ringing in my ears. I scrambled up, flipping on my flashlight, sweeping it across the room. Empty. The only thing left was the lingering scent of gunpowder. The door still stood open, swaying slightly in the wind. We packed our gear in record time. Neither of us spoke as we stepped out into the damp morning air. The storm had passed, leaving the ground slick with mud. As we turned to leave, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. My flashlight caught something on the wooden doorframe, something I hadn't noticed before. Carved deep into the wood, weathered with age, were two words: "Stay out." We never spoke about that night again. We never went back, and I'll never forget the way the air felt inside that cabin. Thick, heavy, suffocating. Like we weren't supposed to be there, like we had never been alone.